The battle for Kestenga, fought intermittently between 1941 and 1944, belongs to the broader context of the often overlooked Arctic front of the Second World War. Located in northern Karelia, near the Finnish-Soviet border, the Kestenga sector became a crucial but secondary theater, where German and Finnish forces attempted to advance eastward in support of larger strategic goals, while the Soviet Union mounted determined resistance. To understand the significance of the prolonged struggle around Kestenga, it is essential to situate it within the geopolitical framework of the war in the north and the conditions that shaped the military balance in this remote region. The background was set by the Winter War of 1939-40, when the Soviet Union attacked Finland and annexed parts of Karelia, including the Karelian Isthmus and regions bordering Lake Ladoga. Although Finland preserved its independence, the territorial concessions fueled resentment and left Helsinki determined to revise the peace settlement. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union in June 1941, Finland entered the conflict as a co-belligerent, seeking to recover lost lands and extend influence deeper into Soviet territory. Germany, for its part, had its own interests in the Arctic. Control of the northern front promised security for vital resources, particularly the nickel mines of Petsamo in Finland, essential for German armament production, and the potential to sever Soviet supply lines moving through Murmansk, the only ice-free northern port connected to Allied convoys. The German-Finnish coalition planned to strike along two principal axes in the far north. One operation, under Mountain Corps North, the other, led by ex-Gei's Army Corps with Finnish participation, advanced eastward through northern Karelia toward Luki and Kandalaksha, aiming to cut the Murmansk railway that linked Murmansk with central Russia. Kestenga lay on this secondary axis, a small settlement but strategically important because of its position astride routes leading to the Murmansk railway. The town itself was modest, consisting of wooden buildings surrounded by forests, marshes, and lakes, but its location made it a key objective for operations in the central Arctic sector. The Soviet Union recognized the threat. The Northern Front, later reorganized as the Karelian Front, was tasked with defending vast territories stretching from Leningrad to the Arctic Ocean. The Red Army deployed several rifle divisions, supported by local garrisons, fortified areas, and naval infantry units detached from the Northern Fleet. Soviet defensive preparations in Karelia emphasized strong points around towns, fortified lines across natural barriers, and reliance on harsh terrain to hinder enemy advances. Soviet planners understood that German and Finnish operations in Karelia aimed to disrupt the Murmansk railway, and they reinforced sectors accordingly, even as larger battles raged further south. Military preparedness in the Kestenga area was uneven. German and Finnish forces committed to the operation included the German 169th Infantry Division, the SS Division Nord, and Finnish 6th Division, supported by artillery and light armor. In total, Axis strength in the Kestenga sector reached approximately 25,000–30,000 men in 1941, though this varied over time as units. Supply lines stretched over hundreds of kilometers from bases in Finland, vulnerable to weather and partisan attacks. Soviet forces defending Kestenga were comparable in size, though often operating with fewer resources. The 186th Rifle Division and later reinforcements from the 23rd Army and Karelian Front were committed to the sector. In 1941, Soviet strength numbered around 20,000 men, with later reinforcements bringing totals higher as the battle dragged on. The defenders faced shortages of transport, winter equipment, and sometimes even basic rations, but they were supported by the Northern Fleet's ability to move supplies along the White Sea and by strong local knowledge of the terrain. Soviet units were also reinforced by local partisan detachments, who harassed Axis supply lines and provided intelligence about movements through forests and swamps. Public sentiment and morale were shaped by national interests. In Finland, the Continuation War was framed as a struggle to regain territory lost in 1940, and Kestenga was viewed as part of this broader goal. For Germany, propaganda emphasized the Arctic struggle as essential to cutting the lifeline to Bolshevism via Murmansk. In the Soviet Union, defense of Karelia was depicted as part of the patriotic defense of the motherland, with local populations mobilized to assist the Red Army. Civilian life in Karelia was devastated. Villages near the front were evacuated, destroyed, or fell under Axis occupation, creating humanitarian crises in a region already marked by harsh winters and food shortages. Intelligence assessments before the first clashes underestimated the difficulties ahead. German and Finnish planners believed that advances through Karelia would be rapid, assuming Soviet forces in the north were weak and disorganized. In reality, the Soviets had prepared stronger defenses than expected, and the terrain itself slowed the pace of operations. Soviet intelligence, conversely, was aware of Axis troop concentrations, but struggled to predict the timing and main axes of advance, leading to a mixture of prepared defenses and emergency responses once the fighting began. Thus, by the summer of 1941, the conditions for the Battle of Kestenga were established. A remote settlement in northern Karelia became the focus of a struggle involving German, Finnish, and Soviet forces. The stakes were high: control of routes to the Murmansk Railway, security of resources, and the prestige of coalition warfare on the Arctic front. The armies were unevenly prepared, constrained by terrain and climate, yet determined to impose their will on a battlefield that would remain active for 3 years, far from the attention drawn by larger campaigns to the south. The opening phase of the Battle of Kestenga began in July 1941 as part of Germany's larger Operation Barbarossa. The initial objective for German and Finnish forces in this Arctic sector was to break through Soviet defenses in northern Karelia and advance toward Luki and Kandalaksha, thereby threatening the Murmansk Railway. This was considered a critical line of communication for the Soviet Union, as Allied convoys arriving in Murmansk depended on it to transfer supplies into central Russia. By seizing Kestenga and pushing east, the Axis hoped to sever this route and isolate Murmansk from the rest of the Soviet war effort. The German 2. Army Corps, composed primarily of the 169th Infantry Division and the SS Division Nord, spearheaded the advance in cooperation with the Finnish 6th Division. The combined force numbered approximately 25,000 men in the Kestenga direction. Tanks and heavy mechanization were largely absent, as the terrain of forests, swamps, and narrow tracks made armored operations nearly impossible. Supply arrangements depended heavily on horse-drawn wagons and pack animals, with long columns moving slowly through primitive forest roads. The Soviet defenders were drawn from the 186th Rifle Division and supporting local units of the Karelian Front. Roughly 20,000 men held positions along fortified lines near rivers and lakes, supported by machine gun nests, anti-tank obstacles, and rudimentary bunkers. Though their artillery was limited, Soviet positions were well chosen to exploit the terrain. Forests and marshes funneled attackers into narrow corridors where they could be held up by relatively small numbers of defenders. The Soviets understood that they could not afford to allow a breakthrough, since Kestenga lay only 50 kilometers from vital stretches of the Murmansk. The opening attacks began in mid-July with artillery preparations and infantry thrusts against Soviet outposts. The German 169th Infantry Division attempted to force a crossing of the Voida River, encountering stiff resistance. Soviet riflemen used dug-in machine guns and mortars to halt repeated attempts, inflicting heavy casualties on attackers who had little cover in the open terrain. The SS Division Nord, lacking experience in Arctic warfare, suffered particularly high losses in its first combat actions, with units thrown into frontal assaults against fortified Soviet lines. Poor coordination between German and Finnish units added to the difficulties, as communications across the wooded landscape were unreliable. The Finnish 6th Division made more progress on the flanks, advancing through forested areas where their troops, familiar with northern conditions, moved with greater. Finnish infantry often bypassed Soviet strongpoints, forcing defenders to retreat to avoid encirclement. However, Soviet counterattacks, supported by small numbers of tanks and aircraft from the Northern Fleet's air arm, checked the Finnish momentum. Soviet pilots bombed Axis supply lines, destroying columns of wagons and disrupting ammunition deliveries. By late July, the Axis advance had slowed considerably as Soviet units dug in along successive defensive lines. Command decisions in the opening phase reflected the different priorities of the participants. German officers, under pressure from Berlin, pressed for rapid progress toward the railway, believing the Soviets were weak in the north. Finnish commanders, however, were more cautious. Their government's primary aim was to recover lost territories from the Winter War, rather than to overextend deep into Soviet territory. On the Soviet side, the Karelian Front, recognizing the importance of the sector, reinforced Kestenga with additional rifle regiments and artillery batteries, determined to hold the line at all costs. For civilians in Karelia, the opening phase brought immediate hardship. Villages near the front were evacuated or burned to prevent their use by advancing forces. Families fled into forests or toward the rear, often leaving livestock and belongings behind. German and Finnish forces seized supplies for their troops, while Soviet authorities implemented scorched earth measures, destroying bridges and food stores to deny them to the enemy. Local civilians, many of them Karelians, Finns, and Russians, were caught between two armies, facing deportations, forced labor, and reprisals depending on which side controlled their territory at a given moment. By the end of August 1941, the initial Axis advance had failed to achieve its objective. German and Finnish forces captured some ground west of Kestenga and inflicted casualties on Soviet defenders, but they did not reach the Murmansk Railway. Soviet counterattacks, combined with the harsh terrain, limited supply, and lack of mechanized support, prevented a decisive breakthrough. Both sides dug into fortified positions, preparing for a prolonged struggle that would stretch over years rather than weeks. The opening phase thus ended not with a decisive victory, but with a stalemate in the Arctic wilderness, setting the stage for the drawn-out battle that would follow. The strategic goals and planning behind the Kestenga sector of the Arctic front reflected both the ambitions and the limitations of the Axis and Soviet coalitions. While the fighting around Kestenga never attracted the scale or attention of campaigns further south, it nonetheless embodied key strategic concerns: the control of communication lines, the safeguarding of vital resources, and the broader struggle for initiative in the Northern Theater. To understand why both sides devoted troops to such an inhospitable region, one must analyze the objectives, doctrines, and logistical challenges that shaped their planning from 1941 onward. For Germany, the Kestenga front was tied directly to its northern strategy, codenamed Operation Silberfuchs, Silver Fox. This operation consisted of several sub-operations aimed at capturing Murmansk and the Murmansk Railway. One arm of the offensive targeted Murmansk directly from Petsamo, while the other, moving east through Kestenga, aimed at Luki and Kandalaksha, where the railway could be severed. German planners believed that cutting this lifeline would isolate Murmansk and cripple the Soviet Union's ability to receive Allied aid through Arctic convoys. This was no minor objective. By 1941, Murmansk had become one of the Soviet Union's few ice-free ports, and between 1941 and 1945, it received nearly 4 million tons of Allied supplies, including vehicles, fuel, and raw materials. A successful advance through Kestenga could have radically altered the supply situation on the Eastern Front. The German X-66 Army Corps, under General Hans Feige, was given responsibility for the sector. It included the 169th Infantry Division and the SS Division Nord, supported by artillery units and engineers. Finnish forces, most notably the 6th Division, operated alongside them. However, planning underestimated the difficulty of the terrain. Axis doctrine emphasized rapid maneuver, encirclement, and concentration of force, but in the Arctic wilderness of Karelia, these principles proved difficult to implement. Narrow forest roads, extensive swamps, and unpredictable weather forced a reliance on infantry advances with limited artillery support, stretching doctrine beyond its tested boundaries. The Finnish strategic goals in Karelia overlapped, but were not identical to those of Germany. Finland's principal war aim in 1941 was to regain the territory lost in the Winter War of 1939-40. Some Finnish leaders also saw an opportunity to expand into East Karelia, which they considered historically or ethnically linked to Finland. However, Finland had little interest in the German objective of severing Allied supply lines to Murmansk. Finnish commanders were cautious about advancing too far east, fearing overextension and high casualties in terrain that offered no direct benefit to Helsinki's national interests. As a result, while Finnish units fought effectively in the Kestenga area, their commitment to German strategic priorities remained conditional. This divergence of goals created tensions in operational planning and would become more apparent as the war dragged on. The Soviet strategic outlook in Karelia was defensive at first, then increasingly counteroffensive as the war turned in their favor. In 1941, the Soviet Northern Front, later reorganized as the Karelian Front, recognized that the Murmansk Railway was a critical artery. Protecting it became a matter of national survival. Soviet planners allocated rifle divisions, artillery regiments, and even naval infantry brigades to defend the Kestenga sector, despite urgent demands for troops in more critical southern theaters. Their doctrine in the north emphasized defense in depth, relying on terrain to slow Axis advances and then mounting counterattacks to regain lost ground. Soviet planning also integrated partisan warfare. Local fighters familiar with the forests and marshes disrupted Axis supply lines, gathered intelligence, and harassed rear areas. Logistics dominated planning for both sides. For the Axis, supply lines into Karelia extended hundreds of kilometers through primitive roads, often little more than forest tracks. Vehicles broke down in muddy conditions during summer or froze in winter, while pack animals and sledges became the main means of transport. Fuel and ammunition shortages were constant, constraining offensive planning. German planners assumed that limited resources would suffice for quick operations, but when the offensive bogged down, resupply became a crippling issue. The Soviets faced similar difficulties, but their logistical base was closer, tied to the Murmansk Railway and the ports of the White Sea. Miscalculations shaped the campaign from the outset. German and Finnish planners assumed that Soviet forces in Karelia were weak, poorly equipped, and incapable of sustained resistance. They believed that a determined push in the summer of 1941 would suffice to reach the railway. In reality, Soviet forces had fortified defensive positions and prepared fallback lines. Moreover, the Soviet ability to draw reinforcements from the Northern Fleet and local reserves surprised the Axis. On the Soviet side, miscalculations lay in underestimating the persistence of German and Finnish offensives and the difficulties of mounting large counterattacks in harsh terrain. Propaganda also played a role in strategic planning. German and Finnish announcements framed the Arctic offensive as part of a larger crusade against Bolshevism. German media stressed the importance of Murmansk as a target, portraying the campaign as essential to cutting off Western aid to the USSR. In Finland, propaganda emphasized the liberation of East Karelia, seeking to inspire soldiers with visions of national reunification. Soviet propaganda responded by highlighting the heroism of defenders in the Arctic wilderness, portraying them as guardians of the lifeline to the motherland. Local populations were mobilized for defense, building fortifications, supplying partisans, and enduring forced evacuations. By late 1941, it was clear that planning on both sides had not accounted fully for the environment. German doctrine of blitzkrieg was blunted in the forests and swamps, while Soviet counteroffensive strategies were limited by the difficulties of concentrating forces in the Arctic. The result was a prolonged struggle of attrition. In subsequent years, Axis planning shifted toward holding captured positions and preventing Soviet. The strategic goals at Kestenga thus reveal the wider contradictions of the Arctic front. For Germany, it was a secondary theater, but linked to the critical objective of cutting Allied supply lines. For Finland, it was a matter of limited territorial ambition, not global strategy. For the Soviet Union, it was a defensive necessity that evolved into a protracted campaign to reclaim lost ground. The clash of these differing priorities, compounded by miscalculations and logistical hardships, ensured that the battle for Kestenga would drag on for years, with no side able to achieve quick or decisive results. The first large-scale clashes around Kestenga erupted in July and August 1941, when German and Finnish forces attempted to carry out their plan to reach the Murmansk Railway by advancing through the remote forests and lakes of northern Karelia. Unlike the sweeping tank battles further south, fighting here took on the character of small unit engagements, protracted assaults on fortified strongpoints, and long struggles through difficult terrain. The opening battles revealed both the strength of Soviet defenses and the limitations of Axis planning in an environment far removed from the conditions of Central Russia or Ukraine. The German 169th Infantry Division and the SS Division Nord bore the brunt of the initial advance east of Suomussalmi toward Kestenga. Supported by the Finnish 6th Division, they sought to break through Soviet positions along the Voita River and push toward Luki. The Axis force numbered roughly 25,000 men in the sector, while Soviet defenders, including the 186th Rifle Division, manned a fortified line with around 20,000 troops. Though the Axis enjoyed artillery superiority and better communications, the Soviets compensated by exploiting terrain and relying on prepared positions. On 1st July 1941, the German and Finnish artillery opened fire along a wide front, pounding Soviet trenches and bunkers. Infantry advances followed, but progress was immediately slowed by marshes, forests, and Soviet resistance. Machine gun nests, camouflaged positions, and minefields caused heavy casualties. German reports noted that the SS Division Nord, inexperienced and inadequately trained for Arctic warfare, faltered in its first engagements. Several of its battalions suffered significant losses when thrown into frontal attacks against entrenched Soviet positions. Morale in the division fell sharply, and commanders had to rely increasingly on the more seasoned 169th Infantry Division and Finnish units to maintain momentum. The Finnish 6th Division, familiar with northern terrain, advanced more effectively on the flanks. Their small unit tactics, developed during the Winter War, allowed them to bypass strong points and use forests for Finnish ski troops and reconnaissance patrols outmaneuvered Soviet defenders, forcing them to abandon positions under threat of encirclement. However, these tactics slowed the overall pace of advance. Each village or fortified line became a battlefield, consuming time and resources. By mid-July, Axis forces had only advanced a few dozen kilometers, far short of their ambitious objectives. Soviet defenders displayed resilience. The 186th Rifle Division, though suffering heavy casualties, withdrew in good order to successive defensive positions, using rivers and lakes as natural barriers. Soviet artillery, though limited in quantity, was used effectively to delay Axis assaults. The Northern Fleet's aviation arm also intervened, bombing German supply lines and targeting Finnish columns on exposed roads. Soviet aircraft, operating from airfields near the White Sea, harassed Axis forces throughout. Civilians in the combat zone faced immediate disruption. Villages near the front lines were evacuated by Soviet authorities or destroyed in scorched earth measures to deny shelter to the advancing enemy. German and Finnish troops requisitioned food and shelter, while many Karelians and Russians fled deeper into Soviet territory. Others were caught in the crossfire, suffering from bombardments and shortages of food. The harsh conditions of the Arctic summer, with swarms of insects, marshy ground, and long daylight hours, added to the misery of both soldiers and civilians. By early August, Axis forces managed to approach the outskirts of Kestenga. The village, defended by Soviet rifle regiments, reinforced with engineers and local militia, became a focal point of the fighting. The Germans launched repeated assaults, supported by artillery barrages. In several instances, yet Soviet troops clung stubbornly to their positions. Each attack was met with counterfire and counterattacks, and the Axis suffered mounting losses. Reports from the SS Division Nord indicate that some battalions were reduced to half strength during these engagements. The Soviet command, recognizing the importance of the Kestenga sector, sent reinforcements from the 23rd Army. Additional rifle regiments and artillery units arrived, strengthening the defensive line. By mid-August, the Soviet forces had not only held Kestenga, but also launched local counterattacks, pushing Axis units back in several sectors. These counterstrikes, though costly, demonstrated the determination of the Red Army to defend the approaches to the Murmansk Railway. The initial phase of combat thus ended in stalemate. Axis forces captured some territory west of Kestenga, but they failed to break through to Luki or to sever the railway. Their offensive momentum was blunted by terrain, weather, and determined Soviet resistance. The Germans and Finns dug in along forward positions, establishing fortified camps and waiting for reinforcements. The Soviets likewise fortified their lines, preparing for further Axis attempts while strengthening their logistics through the Murmansk Railway. By the autumn of 1941, the first clashes at Kestenga had already illustrated the character of the Arctic Front. Slow advances, high casualties relative to gains, and battles shaped more by geography and endurance than by rapid maneuver. Neither side had achieved decisive results, but the Soviet defense had succeeded in preventing the Axis from achieving their immediate strategic objective. The Murmansk Railway remained intact, and Kestenga became a contested zone where fighting would continue in varying intensity for the next 3 years. The escalation of the fighting around Kestenga began in the late summer and autumn of 1941, when the Axis command realized that their initial attempt at a rapid breakthrough had stalled. Instead of a quick advance to the Murmansk Railway, the German XG6 Army Corps and the Finnish 6th Division found themselves drawn into a prolonged struggle for control of key positions along lakes, rivers, and forest corridors. Both sides reinforced their lines, transforming the Arctic wilderness into a fortified front. For the Axis, supply problems quickly emerged as a critical obstacle. The German 169th Infantry Division had entered the campaign with limited stocks of ammunition and rations, dependent on long supply lines stretching back into northern Finland. The primitive roads, often little more than forest tracks, could not handle heavy traffic. Vehicles bogged down in mud during the autumn rains, and horses struggled to carry loads. The SS Division Nord, already weakened by its losses in July, found itself unable to sustain offensive operations without steady resupply. Finnish units were somewhat better adapted, using pack animals and sledges, but they too suffered from shortages as the front extended further into Soviet territory. On the Soviet side, reinforcements and supplies were moved along the Murmansk Railway. Despite constant Axis pressure, the line functioned effectively, bringing in additional rifle regiments, artillery batteries, and equipment from the south. Soviet engineers repaired tracks and bridges damaged by German air raids, while local partisans harassed Axis supply routes. This gave the Red Army defenders in the Kestenga sector a relative advantage. While their conditions were harsh, they remained connected to the broader Soviet war effort in a way the attackers could not match. As autumn approached, weather began to play a decisive role. Heavy rains turned roads into quagmires, immobilizing German trucks and artillery. Soldiers lived in sodden trenches, struggling against both enemy fire and disease. Dysentery and exposure reduced the combat strength of many battalions. When winter arrived early in the Arctic, temperatures dropped sharply, freezing rivers and swamps, but also immobilizing poorly equipped troops. German and Finnish soldiers lacked adequate winter clothing, while Soviet units, accustomed to operating in the region, adapted more effectively with felt boots, fur garments, and improvised shelters. The crisis deepened in October 1941 when Soviet counterattacks struck several points of the Axis line. Reinforced by fresh regiments from the Karelian front, Soviet troops attempted to encircle German positions west of Kestenga. Although these attacks failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough, they inflicted casualties and forced the Germans onto the defensive. The SS Division Nord, in particular, reported severe losses and exhaustion. German officers privately admitted that the division was no longer capable of sustained offensive operations. Civilian populations in Karelia bore the brunt of this escalation. Soviet authorities evacuated villages near the railway, often destroying buildings and food stores to deny them to the enemy. Axis forces requisitioned supplies from those who remained, leaving many families with little to survive the coming winter. Finnish troops, operating in areas with mixed Finnish and Karelian populations, attempted to establish some local administration, but the constant fighting prevented stability. Civilians were displaced repeatedly as the front shifted, with many enduring forced labor or deportations. By the close of 1941, the Kestenga sector had stabilized into a line of opposing fortified positions. The Axis had advanced only a limited distance and had not reached Luki or the Murmansk Railway. The Soviets had held their ground and inflicted heavy losses, but at the cost of thousands of casualties and the destruction of much of the local region. Both sides faced a prolonged and grueling struggle. What had begun as a planned breakthrough evolved into a war of attrition under some of the harshest conditions of the Eastern Front. The peak of the campaign around Kestenga came in 1942, when both sides attempted to break the deadlock established in the first year of the Arctic War. The German High Command, still intent on cutting the Murmansk Railway, ordered renewed offensives in the summer, hoping to capitalize on the generally favorable conditions after the long winter. At the same time, the Soviets were determined to secure their northern lifeline, reinforcing the Karelian front with additional units and artillery. The result was a series of heavy battles in an environment that was already among the most hostile on the eastern front. The Axis offensive began in April and May 1942. The 169th Infantry Division and remnants of the SS Division Nord, supported by Finnish detachments, attempted to break through Soviet defenses near Lake Topozero. Approximately 20,000 Axis troops participated in this effort, supported by artillery batteries and limited air support from bases in northern Finland. The plan was to capture Kestenga fully, then push further east to reach Loki, a town critical for railway operations. The attack was launched along several forest tracks, but the terrain again dictated the pace and form of the fighting. German columns became strung out along narrow paths, and Soviet defenses were layered to exploit these bottlenecks. The Soviet response was swift. The 186th Rifle Division was reinforced by units of the 54th Rifle Division, along with artillery regiments transferred northward. Soviet commanders used the railway effectively to move reinforcements, ensuring that local reserves were available to plug gaps. When Axis units launched their assaults, they encountered strong resistance at every stage. Soviet artillery, though limited in quantity compared to other sectors of the Eastern Front, was employed with precision. Positions overlooking lakes and ridges were turned into kill zones, where advancing troops were pinned down and subjected to sustained fire. The summer campaign around Kestenga turned into a sequence of bitter positional battles. The Germans and Finns would launch concentrated assaults, capturing forward Soviet trenches at great cost, only to be driven back by counterattacks. Soviet forces dug deep networks of trenches and bunkers in the forests, creating defensive belts that slowed every Axis move. Even when villages changed hands, reports from July 1942 indicate that in some sectors, battalions on both sides were reduced to a fraction of their original strength. For example, one regiment of the SS Division Nord was reported at under 50% strength after sustained combat near the Vojta River. Air power played an increasingly important role in this phase. The Soviet Northern Fleet's air units flew dozens of sorties daily, targeting Axis supply columns, artillery positions, and rear depots. German aircraft, limited in number, attempted to provide cover but were stretched thin across the Arctic front. Soviet bombings often forced the Axis to disperse their supply lines, slowing the delivery of ammunition and food to the front. In turn, Finnish reconnaissance patrols harassed Soviet supply routes, ambushing convoys in forest tracks. Civilian life during the peak of the fighting reached its lowest point. Soviet scorched earth measures left little infrastructure for Axis troops to exploit, and surviving civilians were often deported or relocated by whichever army controlled the area at the time. Starvation, forced labor, and displacement became part of the local reality, while partisan groups emerged in the forests, conducting raids against Axis positions. By the end of the 1942 summer campaign, it was evident that neither side had achieved a decisive breakthrough. Axis forces held a forward line west of Kestenga, but they had failed to cut the Murmansk Railway or to capture Luki. The Soviets had prevented the loss of vital infrastructure, but at the cost of heavy casualties and material destruction. The sector hardened into a war of attrition, where both sides maintained fortified lines and awaited opportunities that never fully materialized. The peak of the campaign at Kestenga thus demonstrated the limits of offensive warfare in the Arctic environment. The geography, climate, and determination of the defenders ensured that large-scale results were impossible. What remained was a frozen conflict, literally and figuratively, where control was measured in meters rather than kilometers, and where survival itself became as significant as any tactical gain. As the war in the Kestenga sector settled into stalemate after the inconclusive offensives of 1942, both sides adapted their strategies and methods to endure the prolonged struggle. Resistance became the central theme of life on the Arctic front. Resistance by Soviet defenders determined to keep the Murmansk Railway open, and adaptation by Axis forces struggling to maintain their positions in an environment that punished both attacker and defender with equal severity. For the Soviets, resilience meant more than holding defensive lines. By 1943, the Karelian Front had consolidated its positions around Kestenga and Luki, fortifying strong points and developing a system of interconnected trenches and bunkers. Units rotated regularly along the railway, ensuring that no single division was left to exhaust itself in the difficult conditions. Partisan activity increased steadily, with local fighters disrupting German and Finnish supply columns, ambushing patrols, and relaying intelligence about Axis positions. These partisans were supported by the Soviet command with weapons and supplies brought in via the railway or airdropped into the forests. The Axis forces, for their part, had to accept that rapid advances were no longer possible. The German 169th Infantry Division and the remnants of the SS Division Nord entrenched themselves in defensive positions, relying Finnish patrols, often moving on skis or by foot across swamps and lakes, carried out raids against Soviet forward positions, maintaining pressure and gathering intelligence. German units adapted by building more permanent fortifications, including wooden bunkers, dugouts, and defensive belts of barbed wire and mines. Their strategy shifted toward holding captured ground and preventing Soviet breakthroughs rather than attempting to seize the railway. Adaptation was also necessary on a logistical level. Axis supply lines remained vulnerable, stretched across long distances from bases in Finland. To cope with shortages, commanders introduced rationing, used captured Soviet stores when available, and relied heavily on local requisition. Finnish soldiers sometimes lived off the land, fishing and hunting to supplement their rations. German units, less familiar with the environment, suffered more severely from hunger and disease when supplies failed to reach the front. Winter, with its deep snow and sub-zero temperatures, forced further improvisation as troops constructed makeshift stoves, insulated dugouts, and used sledges for supply transport. On the Soviet side, the Murmansk Railway continued to serve as a lifeline. Trains brought not only reinforcements and equipment, but also food and fuel, which kept the defenders supplied even in the harshest months. Soviet engineers worked tirelessly to repair damage from air raids and sabotage, ensuring that the line remained operational. This logistical advantage meant that Soviet units could withstand prolonged attrition better than their Axis opponents. Psychological endurance was equally important. Soldiers in the Kestenga sector faced long periods of isolation, fighting in remote forests where reinforcements or relief were slow to arrive. Letters and propaganda became tools of morale management. Soviet newspapers and leaflets emphasized the importance of defending the northern route that kept Allied aid flowing. German and Finnish propaganda stressed duty and endurance, though reports reveal that morale was uneven, especially among German units that had not anticipated years of static warfare in such a hostile environment. By 1943, both sides recognized that the Kestenga front was not likely to produce decisive results. Still, neither could afford to abandon the sector. For the Axis, holding ground here tied down Soviet forces and kept pressure on the railway. For the Soviets, every kilometer held meant continued access to supplies vital for the larger Eastern Front. The result was a war of attrition, where adaptation through fortifications, logistical adjustments, and psychological resilience became as important as battlefield victories. The turning point in the Kestenga sector did not come in the form of a single dramatic battle, but rather through the gradual shift in the broader balance of power on the Eastern Front by 1943 and early 1944. The Red Army's victories at Stalingrad and Kursk had altered the strategic situation, and resources could now be directed to secondary theaters, including the Arctic. For the Axis, the inability to achieve their objectives in the north meant that their forces at Kestenga were increasingly exposed, isolated, and drained of fighting strength. In early 1943, Soviet High Command recognized that the Axis lines near Kestenga had become overextended and vulnerable. Reinforcements, including additional rifle regiments, artillery batteries, and specialized ski units, were brought into the sector. Soviet reconnaissance patrols identified In April, Soviet forces launched coordinated local offensives, pressing Axis positions west of Kestenga. Though not aimed at total breakthrough, these attacks inflicted steady attrition and forced the Germans to commit their dwindling reserves. Meanwhile, the Murmansk Railway continued to function reliably, supplying Soviet forces with both domestic and Allied materials. Equipment arriving through Arctic convoys, including trucks, radios, and food supplies, improved the capacity of Soviet troops to conduct sustained operations in the remote environment. The German and Finnish forces had no equivalent reinforcement stream. Axis commanders requested additional divisions and logistical support, but by 1943, the German High Command prioritized the central and southern fronts, leaving the northern armies with limited reinforcements. The cumulative effect of this imbalance became evident through 1943. Soviet artillery bombardments increased in frequency, supported by air raids from the Northern Fleet's aviation units. Axis positions, though fortified, came under constant pressure. German and Finnish patrols were forced onto the defensive, rarely able to mount meaningful counterattacks. The SS Division Nord, which had already suffered devastating casualties in 1941 and 1942, had by this point been reorganized but remained under strength and demoralized. Civilian conditions in Karelia further highlighted the shift. By 1943, Soviet authorities had re-established control over several areas previously contested, rebuilding villages and organizing collective farms under military protection. Civilians who had endured multiple occupations were relocated deeper into Soviet territory to reduce the strain on frontline logistics. In contrast, areas still the presence of partisans intensified, creating an additional burden on Axis garrisons. The psychological effect of the Soviet resurgence was significant. For Axis troops stationed at Kestenga, it became clear that their original mission of cutting the Murmansk Railway was no longer attainable. Reports from German officers spoke of units holding without hope of advance, while Finnish commanders increasingly questioned the necessity of maintaining offensive positions so far from their national borders. The Soviet command, sensing this erosion of Axis resolve, steadily increased pressure through limited offensives that pushed the front line back step by step. By the end of 1943, the turning point had crystallized. The Axis were no longer in a position to contest control of the Murmansk Railway or threaten Luki. The Soviets had not only preserved their lifeline, but had also begun to put the once ambitious Axis strategy of isolating Murmansk had effectively collapsed, and their forces in Karelia were left to defend exposed positions in worsening conditions. The outcome of the struggle at Kestenga was no longer in doubt. It was only a matter of time before Soviet offensives would eliminate the Axis foothold entirely. By the spring of 1944, the Axis position around Kestenga had become untenable. The cumulative effects of 3 years of attritional warfare, logistical strain, and the shifting tide of the Eastern Front left German and Finnish forces unable to maintain their forward lines. Soviet offensives elsewhere had already forced the Germans to commit reserves southward, and the Finnish government, increasingly aware of the war's trajectory, began reconsidering its role in the conflict. The Kestenga sector, once seen as a potential springboard to cut the Murmansk Railway, was now a liability that drained. The Soviet command seized the opportunity. In April and May 1944, reinforced units of the Karelian Front launched coordinated attacks west of Kestenga. Supported by artillery concentrations and airstrikes from the Northern Fleet, Soviet rifle divisions pressed against Axis defensive belts, forcing withdrawals from outlying positions. Although the offensive did not aim to annihilate enemy forces outright, it had the effect of steadily pushing German and Finnish troops back toward their starting lines. Axis strongpoints that had been fortified since 1941 were abandoned under pressure, often destroyed by retreating units to prevent Soviet capture. German reports from the 169th Infantry Division during this period described heavy casualties from artillery barrages and air attacks, combined with severe supply shortages. Ammunition stocks dwindled, forcing units to conserve fire even during critical engagements. With no prospect of reinforcement from the German High Command, the division operated in a purely defensive role, conducting delaying actions while falling back. The remnants of the SS Division Nord, reorganized but never fully restored to strength, also took part in the retreat, leaving behind a trail of destroyed bunkers and minefields. The Finnish 6th Division, operating on the flanks, gradually withdrew toward more defensible positions. Unlike the Germans, the Finns sought to minimize losses and preserve their strength for the defense of their own borders. Their withdrawal was more orderly, reflecting both experience in forest warfare and a recognition that continued fighting at Kestenga no longer served Finnish national interests. By mid-1944, the Finnish leadership had entered negotiations with the Soviet Union, and maintaining costly positions in northern Karelia was inconsistent with this policy shift. For Soviet forces, the aftermath of the Axis retreat represented both a tactical victory and a symbolic success. The Murmansk Railway remained secure, and the threat of its severance had been eliminated. Soviet troops occupied abandoned villages, rebuilt defensive lines further west, and cleared mines and obstacles left behind. Yet the cost was heavy. Thousands of Soviet soldiers had been killed or wounded in the years of fighting, and the local population had endured repeated displacements and devastation. Entire communities were left in ruins, fields uncultivated, and infrastructure destroyed. Humanitarian consequences were stark. Civilians returning to liberated areas found burned homes, destroyed crops, and widespread contamination from mines and unexploded ordnance. Many had to be relocated temporarily while reconstruction efforts began. Soviet authorities initiated programs to restore railway operations and rebuild collective farms, but recovery was slow in the harsh northern climate. By the summer of 1944, the Axis forces had withdrawn from the Kestenga sector entirely. German and Finnish units pulled back toward Finland, consolidating their lines as Soviet pressure mounted across the front. The once fiercely contested corridor had reverted to Soviet control, its strategic importance preserved, but at immense cost in human lives and material destruction. The legacy of the Battle of Kestenga is shaped less by decisive maneuvers or spectacular victories than by the endurance of both armies and the broader strategic significance of the Arctic front. Though overshadowed by Stalingrad, Kursk, and other major campaigns, the struggle for Kestenga between 1941 and 1944 played an important role in ensuring the Soviet Union's ability to maintain vital supply lines and keep pressure on its northern flank. For the Soviet Union, the defense of Kestenga became synonymous with the defense of the Murmansk Railway. The railway carried hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied supplies from Arctic convoys into the Soviet interior, including trucks, aircraft, fuel, food, and raw materials. Without this logistical artery, Soviet industry and armies in the heartland would have suffered greater strain. The fact that Axis forces never succeeded in cutting the line was not due to lack of effort, but rather to the sustained resilience of Soviet defenders in Karelia. The Kestenga battles tied down German and Finnish divisions that might otherwise have been deployed to more decisive sectors, ensuring that the Soviet rear remained intact at a crucial stage of the war. For Germany and its Finnish ally, the campaign left behind a different legacy. The German Landsas Army Corps and the SS Division Nord suffered heavy casualties for minimal strategic gain. Years of fighting in inhospitable terrain eroded morale and consumed supplies that were desperately needed elsewhere. The Finns, though more successful in adapting to the conditions, also saw that the prolonged struggle yielded little benefit for their national goals. By 1944, Finland's decision to disengage from the war was shaped in part by the realization that operations such as those at Kestenga had become unsustainable and disconnected from their original aim of regaining lost territory. Civilian memory of the Kestenga fighting was one of devastation and hardship. Villages were repeatedly destroyed, populations displaced, and local infrastructure ruined. The scars of minefields, burned homes, and lost livelihoods persisted long after the front had moved west. For the people of Karelia, the war meant years of forced evacuations, deportations, and constant uncertainty, conditions that shaped. After the war, reconstruction in this remote region was slow, but Soviet authorities emphasized the symbolic value of Kestenga as part of the broader story of resistance in the Great Patriotic War. In historical analysis, the Kestenga sector has often been overlooked compared to other fronts, but military historians note its importance as an example of how secondary theaters can influence the outcome of wider conflicts. By forcing the Axis to commit significant forces to a remote and strategically difficult area, the Soviets ensured that resources were diverted from other campaigns. The defense of Kestenga also underscored the adaptability of Soviet forces, who combined conventional defense with partisan warfare and logistical ingenuity to hold vital ground. Commemoration of the battle has remained limited outside of Russia and Finland, but within the Soviet Union, it was remembered as part of the larger Arctic struggle. Memorials and war cemeteries in the Karelian region testify to the high human cost of a front no one remembers, yet which played a role in shaping the broader outcome of the war. For Germany and Finland, the legacy was more muted, marked by the recognition of failure in an operation that had once promised to alter the course of the Northern War, but ultimately ended in retreat. In the end, the Battle of Kestenga represents a war of endurance, fought not for glory, but for survival and strategic necessity. It demonstrated how geography, climate, and logistics could shape the outcome of campaigns as decisively as weapons or numbers. Its significance lay in what did not happen. The Murmansk Railway was never cut, Murmansk never isolated, and Allied supplies never stopped flowing into the Soviet Union. That alone made the prolonged struggle in the forests and swamps of Karelia a critical, if often forgotten, component of the Eastern Front.